that socialism has become very popular.
Failed in all countries where attempted.
Every time a country started down the socialist path, it
because
failed.
Marxism doesn't work as a positive thing, as a way of running an economy. Marxism ruins everything.
Before we get into this, when I started this video, it was supposed to be about highlighting successful socialist experiments, which it still is. But as I kept researching and reading, a common theme popped up. Whenever a socialist state started to see success, it was immediately met with Western-backed sanctions or coups d'etats. Now, this is something I already knew, but I didn't fully contend with this fact until I was 2 days into editing this video. That's when I realized I was asking the wrong question. I should have been asking, does socialism always fail? And if it does, is it due to an integral flaw with the concept? Or is it due to constant stifling from the imperial core? I'll leave that up to you. Here is the video. A common response by the left to the claim that every socialist experiment failed is to claim that those failed socialist states weren't truly socialist. This is a claim I don't necessarily disagree with, by the way. I do believe that many old communist states devolved into tyranny and state capitalism due to the fact that the old oppressive dynamic between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat wasn't appropriately challenged or dismantled. Instead, the state just mirrored that same dynamic, resulting in the people's subordination to the state instead of their subordination to the capitalist class. This is a contested topic, but we don't even need to argue on these grounds. For the sake of this video, I will not invoke the "it was state capitalist" argument. Another common approach to the claim that every socialist state was a failure is to hype up the accomplishments of past totalitarian regimes, like the Soviet Union. Now, I'm very critical of the USSR and their egregious human rights violations, but we should be able to highlight and, more importantly, learn from what they did manage to accomplish and do so without playing defense for them. And that leads me to how, in this video, I will delineate between what I consider to be successful and unsuccessful socialist experiments. The three major criteria I will use to determine if a socialist experiment was a success are: 1. It improved the quality of life for the most amount of people. 2. It replaced a regime that was significantly worse. And 3. It did so without resulting in any sort of human rights catastrophe. A few things I want to really quickly touch on before we get into the thick of this video. Oftentimes, when a socialist country experiences economic or political hardship, there are anti-communists ready to gleefully bask in its suffering so that they could place the blame on socialism. I shouldn't have to point out how obviously inhumane this is. I would not point to the crippled economy of Argentina at the hands of anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei and gloat about how superior my ideology is. There's a lot of real people bearing the brunt of his stupidity.
Afuera!
But aside from the obvious douchebaggery, oftentimes when socialist countries experience turmoil, it isn't even due to socialism. Venezuela is a great example. No, socialism did not destroy Venezuela. Dutch disease, along with other things, did. Venezuela hitched its bets to its oil industry and failed to diversify its exports or properly nurture other economic sectors. Venezuela also suffered sanctions, corruption, and other economic devastation that had nothing to do with socialism. Successful socialist experiment number 1. Burkina Faso at the hands of Thomas Sankara. Sankara is a personal hero of mine. I could go on for hours about him, but for the sake of brevity, I won't fangirl this time. Sankara was born in 1949 in what is now known as Burkina Faso, but at the time it was a French colony called Upper Volta. Upper Volta was one of the poorest countries in West Africa. It was largely an agrarian society with low rates of productivity. It lacked significantly when it came to infrastructure. It had high levels of unemployment, low literacy rates, gender discrimination, and poor healthcare. To top it off, droughts and other environmental issues were prevalent, and due to underdeveloped infrastructure, they negatively impacted crop yields, which led to more poverty. Sankara, an anti-colonialist Marxist-Leninist, overthrew the existing regime in 1983, and one of his first decisions was to rename Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of upright men. Now I know what you might be thinking. What a sexist douche. Women lived there too, Thomas. But he was actually based as hell when it came to gender discrimination. This little pamphlet is a copy of his 1987 Women's Day speech, where the central thesis is that the revolution could not prosper without the emancipation of women. He also prohibited both female genital mutilation and forced marriages. In addition to this, he built schools, water reservoirs, medical centers, raised the literacy rate, planted 10 million trees to combat desertification, vaccinated millions against meningitis, measles, and yellow fever, And for those who think socialism is an economically unsound theory, Sankara improved the economy and agriculture so drastically that within only 4 years, UN analysts declared the country food self-sufficient. Unfortunately, this story does not have a happy ending. Sankara was killed in a coup in 1987, and Burkina Faso regressed without him. Successful socialist experiment number 2, Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala. In the 50s, an American business called the United Fruit Company had disproportionate control over the Guatemalan economy. They owned about 500,000 acres of land, ports, railroads, and more. This purchasing and appropriating of Guatemalan land forced the peasantry of Guatemala into a terrible quality of life. Through ostracizing the people of Guatemala from their own resource-rich lands and exploiting said lands for the financial gain of American big business, the United Fruit Company played its role in exacerbating wealth inequality in the country. Unfortunately, this is a story that is not all too uncommon in the global south, yet in the imperial core, we always find a way to demonize the people who choose to do something about the situation we've imposed upon them. Jacobo Arbenz is one of those people. Democratically elected Arbenz knew that he had to do something about the way that American big business was destroying the country, so he purchased the land back and redistributed it to the people of Guatemala. By 1954, a sixth of the population had received land due to Arbenz's reform law, formerly known as Decree 900. This legendary agrarian reform program not only resulted in higher living conditions for many farmers and their families, but it stuck up to big corporate imperialist bullies, told them that Latin America is not their playpen, and proved to be influential across the continent. The Americans subsequently funded, launched, and orchestrated the coup that exiled Arbenz. This CIA operation was called PB Success if you want to read more about it. But there was a certain individual who was living in Guatemala at the time, and he happened to witness all of this and take inspiration from Arbenz and his policies, and that individual was Che Guevara. Successful socialist experiment number 3, Salvador Allende's Chile. Now this case is one that I think is very nuanced, but I firmly believe that Allende's Chile, when all was said and done, was a successful implementation of socialist policies, and I'll explain why. Salvador Allende was a democratically elected socialist who nationalized mines, telephone lines, and more in Chile. His socialist policies raised the quality of life for many Chileans, helped the country fight back against inflation that was ravaging not only the country, but most of the continent. He lowered unemployment, and he helped create the Chilean National Health Service, which was the first program in the Americas to guarantee universal healthcare. All of these achievements occurred within the first year of his presidency and proved how quickly good policy could turn a country around. Now, if you can sense a but coming in my delivery, you would be right. Allende's socialist policies were working well until the second year of his term. American intervention in Chile became so aggressive and overbearing that it's hard to believe any country, socialist or not, would be able to hold its own. The American government and American economists, namely Milton Friedman, did whatever they could to meddle with the Chilean economy. Friedman was a notorious economist who promoted economic theories of mass privatization, defunding social programs, and overall hypercapitalism. He was one of the faces of neoliberal economics at the time. The Americans launched the Chile Project in the 50s with the goal of turning Chile into a massive neoliberal experiment. Many Chileans, now known as the Chicago Boys, were brought to Chicago to study under Milton Friedman. When those Chicago boys returned home, and when Allende, who threatened to nationalize U.S. copper mines, became president, both the U.S. government and the indoctrinated Chicago boys fueled domestic flames, leading to lockouts, strikes, and boycotts. These lockouts were promoted heavily by the Nixon administration with the goal to halt the Chilean economy. Local business owners, truckers, and other Chileans, in an attempt to spite Allende, would withhold their products or mark them up unnecessarily to artificially demean the economy. In addition to this, copper, which was Chile's biggest export, was not only suffering a drop in price, but there was a reluctance to purchase Chilean copper due to America's disapproval of the country. Things like this always make me wonder, if socialism is such a bad idea from the get-go and it's doomed to fail, then why does the West constantly feel the need to intervene and spend billions of dollars or kill millions of people to make sure that it fails? I thought it was doomed from the jump. Why would Nixon need to give the direct order, and I quote, "make the economy scream," when referring to what he wanted to see done about Allende's Chile? I thought this shit was supposed to crumble on its own. Long story short, September 11th, 1973, Allende was killed in a coup and replaced by a military junta, which then devolved into the right-wing dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. Now, you would think that since the pesky socialist was out of the equation, the economy would boom under Pinochet, especially since one of his economic advisors was the great Milton Friedman, one of the thought leaders behind neoliberal capitalism. But no. The opposite happened, actually. I'm going to read you a few lines from one of my favorite books, The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. In 1982, despite its strict adherence to Chicago Doctrine, Chile's economy crashed. Its debt exploded, it faced hyperinflation once again, and unemployment hit 30%, 10 times higher than it was under Allende. The only thing that protected Chile from a complete economic collapse in the early 80s was that Pinochet had never privatized Codelco, the state copper mine company nationalized by Allende. That one company generated 85% of Chile's export revenues, which meant that when the financial bubble burst, the state still had a steady source of funds. So not only were Allende's policies preferable to Friedman's and Pinochet's, but Allende was literally saving the economy from beyond the grave. I'll leave you with a quote from a super normal and definitely not evil dude named Henry Kissinger. We didn't do it. I mean, we helped them. We created the conditions as great as possible. One argument I often hear from anti-socialists is, well, if ex-socialist country can be destroyed by sanctions, embargoes, and Western intervention, then socialism is to blame because it created a weak and susceptible country. This line of logic is idiotic. The West has sanctioned non-socialist countries in the past, and they have also suffered similar economic troubles. But to make an ethical argument here, I don't think it's right to blame a sovereign, developing socialist, or neoliberal country for that matter, for being stifled by the largest global superpower and its embargoes, sanctions, or coups d'etats. In stark contrast to all of these aforementioned examples of what I consider to be successful socialist experiments, I can list a great many failed capitalist societies. One could make the argument that America, being the richest country in the world where one of the primary causes of premature death is treatable illness, is not only a pragmatic and logistic failing, but a moral abomination. That's all from me. If you liked the video, let me know in the comments, like and subscribe, and if you hated it, tell me why. Tell me to f off in the comments.